The Duke gave his worthless maid the servant's share of the will. Unaware, her father left her everything. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and been looked through as though you were made of glass, you will know exactly how Vera Sutton stood in the front parlour of Ashmore Hall on the last Monday of January. The cold came in under the door and settled along the skirting boards the way cold always did in that room, which faced north and received no sun in winter. The staff had been assembled at 9:30, pulled from their work without explanation, and they stood now in their 2 rough rows, the upper servants nearest the fire and the lower ones at the back where the draught was worst. Vera stood at the back. She had learned over 3 years at Ashmore Hall that the back was the most honest place. Edmund Ashmore, Duke of Ashmore, stood at the writing table with a single sheet of paper and read from it without preamble. He did not begin with a word about Mrs. Fenn, who had run this household for 11 years and died quietly in her own bed in November. He did not look up from the page. He read the bequests the way a man reads the household accounts, correctly, efficiently, without feeling. Mrs. Alderton received the housekeeper's ring of keys and a ledger bound in brown calfskin. She received these in person, crossing the room to take them, and she held them with the careful expression of a woman who had expected nothing less and intended to show she expected nothing more. The other bequests came in order. A few pounds here, a good coat there, a set of monogrammed handkerchiefs. Then the Duke said, to the paper, £12 and 1 cedar box, to Vera Sutton. He turned the page and continued. Agnes pressed her arm from the left, a small, firm pressure that lasted only a moment. Vera did not move. She kept her hands folded in front of her apron and her face arranged in the expression she had been arranging for 3 years. Attentive, composed, absent of anything that could be read or used. The Duke read 2 more names and set the paper down, and that was the end of it. The room began to empty, with the quiet efficiency of people who have work waiting. Vera collected the cedar box from the side table where it had been placed with the other small effects. It was lighter than she expected. The wood was pale and smooth and smelled faintly of the lavender Mrs. Fenn had kept in everything she owned. Agnes asked, in a low voice, if she was all right. Vera said she was. She went to the linen cupboard on the upper corridor, which was the quietest place she knew, and she sat on the low stool and opened the box. Dried lavender, 3 small sprigs, the flowers gone to dust at the edges, the £12 in coin, wrapped in a fold of cloth, exact to the penny, and beneath those, a letter. She recognized the handwriting at once. It was her father's. She had not seen that handwriting in 4 years, not since the last letter she had written to him had come back unopened with a single word across the seal that was not in his hand, which meant he had not been the one to send it back, and she had stopped writing after that, and told herself it was the more dignified choice. She looked at the letter for a long time. Then she folded it back where it was, closed the cedar box, and pressed both hands flat against the lid until the feeling in her chest was something she could carry rather than something that carried her. She set the box on the high shelf above the spare pillowcases, where it would be safe. Then she went back down the stairs and back to work, because the fires in the east corridor still needed laying, and the cold was not going to wait. February came in grey and stayed grey. The fires burned through twice the wood the house had used in January, and Vera kept the coal scuttles filled and said nothing about the cold, because the cold was not a problem she had been asked to solve. She aired the guest rooms that would not be used. She polished the brass on the second landing. She worked the way she always worked, which was to find what needed doing and do it before anyone had to ask. Mrs. Alderton moved through the house with the brown calfskin ledger under her arm and made notes in it with a particular expression, the expression of a woman assessing what she had inherited and finding some of it satisfactory and some of it wanting. She had not spoken to Vera directly in 3 days, which was not unusual. Upper servants spoke to lower ones when they required something. Vera did not require speaking to very often, because she anticipated the requirements before they were formed. The post came each morning with the milk. It was Thomas Calder's habit to receive it at the side door and sort it on the hall table, correspondence for the Duke to one side, household matters to the other. In the second week of February, he had the East Window Room accounts to review and left the sorting to Mrs. Alderton, who was standing nearby with her ledger. There was a letter that morning, addressed in a hand Mrs. Alderton didn't recognize, directed to Miss Vera Sutton, care of Ashmore Hall. She read the name on the envelope. She turned it once. She told herself it was only order. Correspondence for household staff, when it arrived improperly, went to the housekeeper first. That was the rule. She was the housekeeper. She put the letter in the household correspondence drawer beneath the hall table, behind the quarter-day receipts and the butcher's invoice, and smoothed the front of her apron and went to find Mrs. Hale about the linen. Vera did not know the letter existed. She spent the morning in the Duke's study, relining the lower bookshelves where the paper had softened and begun to separate at the corners. It was fine work, fiddly enough to keep her hands occupied, quiet enough to let the house speak around her. The Duke's study did not announce itself. It was a room that worked, not a room that impressed, and it smelled of the wood oil used on the desk and the old must of books that had not been moved in several years. A stack of correspondence sat to one side of the writing surface, weighted with a glass disc. When she moved to reline the shelf directly behind the desk, she shifted the stack carefully, 2 hands, and set it on the chair. The top sheet of the correspondence was face up. She had not turned it. It had lain that way already. She did not read it. She saw the number at the bottom, because the number was large and written in red ink, and occupied the corner of the page the way a stone occupies the bottom of a clear pool, obvious without being sought. She did not know the context of it. She replaced the stack on the desk, 2 hands, exactly as she had found it, and went back to the shelf paper. There was a particular skill in knowing which things were not yours to look at and setting them down cleanly when they arrived in your hands by accident. Vera had been practicing that skill for 3 years. She was very good at it. She finished the lower shelves by 11:30 and gathered her papers and her paste-pot and went quietly out. Downstairs in the estate room, Thomas Calder spread the quarterly accounts across the table and went through them line by line with the Duke, who stood with his hands behind his back and listened and said very little. Calder noted the figure plainly. The litigation had cost what it had cost. The reserves were thin. The Duke said he understood and asked what the margin was, and Calder told him, and that was the whole of what either of them said about it. The cold pressed against the window glass. The fires burned. Vera reset the hall chairs in the afternoon and did not think about the cedar box on the upper shelf or the letter inside it in her father's hand. She was very good at not thinking about certain things. She had learned it the same place she had learned everything else that kept her upright. The hard way and alone. The cold snap arrived on a Tuesday and didn't leave. By Wednesday morning, the water in the upper corridor basin had a skin of ice on it. And Agnes, who had been sniffling since Sunday, came down the back stairs at 6, with her eyes streaming and her voice gone to a thread, and Vera took one look at her and told her to go back to bed. Agnes said she couldn't. Vera said she could, and she would, and Vera would manage. Agnes went, It was not authorized. Nothing about it was authorized. Vera took Agnes's morning duties and her own, and moved through the house in the grey pre-light, laying fires and filling scuttles, and carrying the breakfast things up from the kitchen, while Mrs. Alderton was still in her room, with her ledger and her morning tea. There was a particular economy required when one person was doing the work of two, and Vera practiced it without thinking, cutting the route, combining the trips, knowing which fires could wait an extra quarter hour and which could not. The Duke passed her in the east corridor on the first morning and said nothing. He passed her again on the second morning, in the same corridor, when she had a coal scuttle in each hand and her cap was slightly off-centre from the low door frame she had come through. He said nothing that time either, and she did not expect him to. The Duke did not notice her. This was not a complaint. It was simply the geography of Ashmore Hall. On the third morning he stopped. She had just come around the turn at the top of the service stairs with the scuttles when she heard his footsteps halt and turned to find him standing perhaps 4 feet away, looking at her in a way he had not looked at her before. Not through her. At her. The way you look at a problem you have only just noticed is there. He said, "Who authorized the additional work?" Vera said, "I authorized it myself." He looked at her for a moment longer. It was not a long moment, but it was a complete one, the kind where she could see him deciding what to do with the answer. She could see the category she had been placed in before, and the small friction of the answer not fitting it. He said she was to record the additional hours with Calder. Then he walked on. Vera picked up the scuttles and continued down the corridor. He had known Calder's name. He had not known hers. She set it down the way she set most things down. Cleanly, without ceremony, with the practice of 3 years behind her. Lady Miriam Ashmore arrived that same afternoon without notice, in a hired coach from Bath, with 2 trunks and a leather satchel, and an expression that said she had decided to come and had seen no reason to consult anyone about it. She was a small woman with a straight back and a way of looking at a room that took its full measure in under 10 seconds. She took the measure of the hall, the drawing room, the east passage, and the Duke at dinner. And then she set her wine-glass down and said his house smelled like an empty church. The Duke said nothing. Lady Miriam said nothing further, in the manner of a woman who has made her point and is content to let it land. She encountered Vera the following morning, near the foot of the service stairs, where Vera was carrying a coal scuttle toward the back sitting-room. Lady Miriam stopped in the passage and looked at her with the same direct attention she had given the rooms, except this attention was different. It was interested, not in the scuttle, not in the direction Vera was heading, but in Vera. She asked Vera her name. Vera told her. She asked how long Vera had been at Ashmore Hall. Vera said 3 years. She asked whether Vera had always done double rounds when the other staff were ill, or whether this was a new arrangement. Vera said it had always been the arrangement when it was needed. Lady Miriam looked at her for a moment, in which Vera waited for the conversation to conclude, the way conversations like this always concluded, with a nod and a dismissal. Lady Miriam did not nod and dismiss. She said, "That seems like a great deal to ask of one person," and she said it as though Vera's answer would matter. Vera did not know what to do with that. She said yes, perhaps it was, and Lady Miriam said nothing more and let her pass. Vera went down the corridor and thought about it for the rest of the morning. No one at Ashmore Hall had ever said that to her before. Lady Miriam's sitting room was the warmest room in Ashmore Hall. Vera noticed it the moment she crossed the threshold, the way the heat settled against her face like a hand. A proper fire, built up past courtesy into actual use, and the curtains drawn back to let in what thin light the February sky was offering. The room smelled of bergamot and warm wool. It did not smell like the rest of the house. Lady Miriam was seated near the window with a piece of cloth across her knee. She looked up when Vera entered and said there was a hem that wanted re-stitching. Would Vera do it? And then she said sit down and gestured toward the chair opposite, as though the instruction were perfectly natural. Vera sat. She stitched. Lady Miriam asked, in a tone of moderate interest, how the linen stores were ordered. Vera told her. She asked about the arrangement of the winter guest rooms, which fires were laid and which were not, and whether the rotation was Mrs. Alderton's system or one carried over from Mrs. Fenn. Vera answered each question plainly, naming no one by fault. She said the current rotation was a recent change. She said some of the rooms that had been kept ready in Mrs. Fenn's time were now set back to cold. She said the coal expenditure had likely come down accordingly. Lady Miriam listened to all of it, with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on some middle point above Vera's shoulder. She asked whether the East Passage fire had always been banked so low in the mornings. Vera said it had not always been the practice. Lady Miriam said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "And what do you make of that?" It was the kind of question that could end a housemaid's position if answered honestly. And Vera knew it, and Lady Miriam appeared to know that she knew it, because she watched her with the patience of a woman who is not going to fill the silence herself. Vera said, "I think the coal costs are real, and the decisions that made them are reasonable ones, and some other decisions might be reviewed, but that is not for me to say." Lady Miriam smiled. It was a small thing, contained and precise, the smile of someone who has received exactly the answer she was testing for. She said, "No, but it was for you to see." "And you did." Vera finished the hem. She set the cloth on the chair arm and stood. Lady Miriam let her get as far as the door. Then she said, without turning, "How long has it been since someone looked after you, Vera?" Not a question with an answer she expected, the kind that arrives at you sideways and finds the particular place you keep unguarded. Vera stood with her hand on the door frame and said she managed well enough. "Thank you, my lady." Lady Miriam said, "I expect you do." Vera went out. She was halfway down the corridor before the warmth of the room stopped being something she felt on her skin and became something else, something she carried in her chest that was not entirely comfortable, like a coal just placed in a cold grate before the draught has caught. She did not have time for it. She set it down. Mrs. Alderton was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with her ledger and an expression that had been prepared in advance. She told Vera, in a carrying voice, with Agnes and 2 other maids standing nearby, that effective tomorrow, Vera would be reassigned to the north rooms and the rear passage, as the rotation of duties required fresh coverage in the coldest quarters. The north rooms were the furthest from the service stairs and the hardest to heat. Everyone in the corridor knew it. Agnes opened her mouth. Vera put a quiet hand on her arm. She told Mrs. Alderton she understood and would begin in the morning. Mrs. Alderton nodded and walked away with her ledger. Agnes, when she was gone, hissed that it was a punishment and nothing else, and that it wasn't fair. Vera said, "No, it probably isn't." She said it without heat. She said it the way you state the weather. Agnes said, "Doesn't that make you angry?" Vera thought about the warmth of Lady Miriam's room, and the question at the door, and the hem she had stitched for 20 minutes, while a sharp woman took a careful measure of something. She said, "Fury is a cost I cannot afford right now." She went upstairs, Under her cot, the cedar box sat in the dark, her father's letter inside it, still unopened. She did not open it that night. She was not ready. The second letter arrived on a Thursday. Vera did not see it arrive. She was in the north rooms when the morning post came, working her way through the sequence Mrs. Alderton had assigned her, carrying wood and water up 2 flights of stairs that the rest of the household had no reason to use. The north rooms were cold in a particular way, the cold of spaces that had not held warmth in weeks, that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Vera worked in her coat. She passed Mrs. Alderton's office on her way back to the linen cupboard before noon. The door was ajar, which it usually was not, and she heard the sound of the correspondence drawer opening, the dry slide of wood on wood, and then closing again. She didn't stop. She was carrying an armload of fresh folded pillow slips, and there was no reason to stop. She noted it the way she noted everything at Ashmore Hall, filed it quietly, and moved on. She had noticed Mrs. Alderton checking that drawer 3 times in the past fortnight, always when the corridor was empty, always with the door half closed after. Vera did not know what was in it. She knew only that something was. She filed that too. In the East Room that same afternoon, the Duke asked Calder whether any correspondence had come in requiring estate attention. Calder said there was nothing beyond the usual. The timber invoice from Wetherby, the farrier's account, a letter from the land agent in the Northfield matter that wanted a reply before the end of the month. The Duke said he would see to the land agent. He did not ask about letters for staff. Calder did not mention any. There was no reason either man would think to. The drawer stayed shut. That evening, Vera sat on her cot with her coat still on, because the small room off the laundry had not yet taken the chill off, and she reached beneath the cot and brought out the cedar box. She had been bringing it out in her mind for weeks. She had not brought it out, in fact, until now. The lavender smell came up when she lifted the lid, faint and dry. The £12 were still there, wrapped in cloth. She did not touch them. She lifted out the letter from beneath them, the one in her father's handwriting, the one she had recognized on the day of the distribution, and put away without opening. She had put it away because she was not ready. She had not said that to anyone. She had not needed to. The letter was old. She could tell by the paper, which had softened at the fold, and by the way the ink had faded at the edges to brown. He had written it years ago, before the estrangement had gone to silence, before she had sent him a letter and he had returned it unopened, which was the moment she had understood that the distance between them had become permanent. He had not forgotten her. That was what the letter said, in 3 short paragraphs, in his careful merchant's hand, the hand she had grown up watching move across accounts. He did not name figures. He made no promises. He said only that he knew he had not done well by her, and that he had not forgotten her, and that he hoped she was warm. He hoped she was warm. Vera sat with the letter for a long time. The laundry room settled into quiet around her. The fire in the kitchen below had banked for the night, and the sounds of the house had gone down to nothing. She was not warm. She was wearing her coat in a room off a laundry at the cold end of Ashmore Hall. But the letter was in her hands, and her father's handwriting was on it, and he was dead, though she did not yet know that, and whatever the letter was worth, she was holding it. She folded it back along its old crease, and put it in the cedar box, and put the cedar box under the cot. She did not cry. She sat in the dark for a while instead, with her hands in her lap, very still. Then she lay down and pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes, and did not sleep for a long time. The discrepancy was in the March linen order of 3 years prior. 14 yards of Holland cloth, charged to the household account at a price that did not match the supplier's usual rate, and credited to a draper in York that Calder could not find in any subsequent ledger. He brought it to Vera in the North Passage on a Tuesday morning, ledger open in his hands, because she had been the one to take delivery of linen under Mrs. Fenn, and he thought she might recall it. Vera set down her brush. She said, "That would have been Marsden's on Gillygate. Mrs. Fenn used them for the heavier cloths. The order was 14.5 yards, not 14, and the price was 1 shilling and 4p per yard. The delivery came on a Wednesday, because the carter from York did not run on Tuesdays." Calder looked at her. He looked down at the ledger. He wrote it down without speaking. She picked up her brush and went back to the skirting. He said, "You weren't asked to keep records of it." She said, "No." He said, "But you remember the exact figure." She said, "I remember most of them." She said it without particular emphasis, the way you state a fact about the weather. Calder stood in the North Passage with his pen in his hand and looked at her for a moment, and then he wrote something else in the ledger margin and thanked her and went away. The Duke was at the far end of the passage. Vera had not known he was there. He had come up from the east stair without sound, the way large, quiet men sometimes move through houses they have owned all their lives, and he was standing with one hand on the wall bracket, reading something, or appearing to read something, and he had been there for the last part of the exchange at least. He did not speak. He did not look up from the paper in his hand. Vera took her brush and her bucket and went on with the skirting board. She finished the North Passage and went downstairs. That afternoon, the Duke found Calder in the East Room and asked him, with the careful quietness of a man arranging a tone in advance, how long the girl had been in the house. Calder said 4 years, near enough. Started under Mrs. Fenn before Christmas of the first year. Knows the household accounts better than the accounts know themselves. The Duke was briefly still. He said, "She gave those figures from memory." Calder said, "She gave them the way you and I give our own names." The Duke looked at the window. He said nothing further, and Calder, who was a pragmatic man and knew when a subject had been received, went back to his columns. In Mrs. Alderton's office, the door was fully shut for once. She had been in the passage earlier, not as far down as the north end, but near enough to hear Calder's pen scratch, near enough to hear Vera's voice, steady and unhurried, reciting a date and a draper's name and a price per yard from 3 years gone, as though she had written it down that morning. Mrs. Alderton went to the correspondence drawer. She took out both letters. She read the second one in full, slowly, which she had not done the first time. The second time the language was plainer. The matter, Peel had written, was of some urgency and some value, and Miss Sutton would do well to instruct him at her earliest convenience on how to proceed with the administration of the estate. The estate. Mrs. Alderton read that word again. Then she read the figure named in the following line, the one she had skimmed past the first time, as though it were a number too large to hold. She set the letter down on the desk and looked at it. Outside the window, the February afternoon was going grey and flat, and the wind was picking up along the gravel drive. She folded both letters and put them back in the drawer. She closed it. She sat for a long time with her hands in her lap and thought about a housemaid who remembered prices by the yard from 3 years ago, and had the attention of Thomas Calder, and, as of this afternoon, something that looked very much like the quiet notice of the Duke. She did not deliver the letters. Mrs. Alderton sent for Vera on a Wednesday morning, at the hour when the rest of the household was occupied and the office corridor was quiet. Vera had been folding clean napkins in the linen room. She set them down, smoothed the stack, and went. The office was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. A proper fire, built up well past the point the household coal allowance strictly allowed for a room of that size. Mrs. Alderton was at her desk, with her hands folded, and her face arranged into something that was almost pleasant. She said, "Sit down, Vera." Vera sat. Mrs. Alderton said she had been thinking about Vera's situation, that with spring quarter approaching, there were certain adjustments to be made in the household arrangements, that there was, in fact, an opportunity Vera might wish to consider. A good character reference, thorough and warm, suitable for any house in the county, and a month's wages in advance of quarter day, which was more than most staff received upon a voluntary departure. Vera listened. Mrs. Alderton said it was, of course, entirely Vera's choice. She used the word choice twice. She kept her hands folded and her voice even, and she didn't once say what Vera was expected to do in exchange for these generosities. She did not need to. The shape of it was clear enough. Vera said, "Thank you, Mrs. Alderton." She said it pleasantly. She waited. Mrs. Alderton waited too. Vera said, "I don't believe I'll take it." A pause. Not long, but long enough that the fire had time to settle and pop before Mrs. Alderton spoke again. She said, "I would think carefully if I were you." Vera said, "I expect I will. I generally do." She said it without sharpness. She meant it without sharpness. She stood, smoothed her apron, and thanked Mrs. Alderton for her time. The composure on Mrs. Alderton's face did not slip exactly. It pulled, the way fabric pulls at a seam under pressure, not torn, but strained in a way that showed where the weakness was. Vera went back to the linen room and finished the napkins. She did not tell Agnes. Agnes would have been furious, and fury was loud, and what Vera needed just now was quiet. She thought about it carefully, as she had said she would. Mrs. Alderton had offered her money and a reference to leave before quarter day. She had not said why. She had not mentioned letters or parcels or anything arriving at the house. She had not mentioned Vera's father, but something had come, something was waiting. Vera was as certain of this as she was of the cold in the north rooms and the draper's price per yard. She waited until after supper, when Mrs. Alderton retired, and the office was dark, and the key to the household correspondence drawer hung, as it always did after hours, on the hook beside the kitchen hearth. It was not locked. It had never needed to be locked before. Vera lit a candle and went. The drawer opened smoothly. There were 2 letters inside, both addressed to Miss Vera Sutton, both unopened as far as she could tell. The first had no return address she recognized. The second was marked urgent, the word written in a hand more deliberate than the first. She took them into the passageway where the candle held steady and read them both. The first was from a solicitor named Peel in Leeds. It was formal and measured. It informed her that her father, Mr. Harold Sutton, had died in November, and that, as the sole beneficiary named in his will, she was required to communicate with his office at her earliest convenience regarding the administration of his estate. November. Her father had died in November. Vera stood in the cold passageway and held the letter, and didn't move. The second letter said the same things in shorter sentences, and added only that the matter was of some urgency and some value, and that Peel hoped she had received his earlier correspondence. She read them each again. Then she stood in the dark and let the information settle into her the way cold settles, slowly, into everything. Her father was dead. There was an estate. A solicitor in Leeds was waiting to hear from her. She folded both letters carefully along their creases and tucked them into her apron pocket. She went upstairs, sat on her cot, and thought for a long while. Then she took out the small writing case she kept beneath the cedar box, opened it, and began to write to Peel. Peel's reply came within a fortnight. It arrived not in the ordinary post, but by separate courier, a lean young man in a dark coat, who appeared at the front door on a Thursday morning and asked, by name, for Miss Vera Sutton. Thomas Calder was crossing the hall when the man knocked. He heard the name, signed for the letter himself, and carried it up to the north passage where Vera was working. He held it out without ceremony. She looked at it. Her name was written on the front in a careful formal hand, and below it, in smaller letters, personal, for the addressee only. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Calder." He gave a short nod and went back the way he had come, asking nothing. Vera waited until her morning work was finished. She ate at the servants' table, cleared her place, said nothing particular to Agnes, and went upstairs to her room. She sat on the cot and broke the seal. The letter was thorough. Peel was a precise man, and he wrote the way precise men do, in measured lines with figures given in full. He named the Sutton warehouses, the townhouse on Marsh Lane in Leeds, and the funds held in trust since her father had structured them that way the previous August, apparently knowing the winter would be hard on him, and wishing the business to be orderly. Then he named the total sum. Vera read it once. She read it again. She read it a third time, with her finger under the numbers, as though her finger might find a different answer than her eyes had. It did not. She set the letter on her knee and looked at the wall. The wall was the same wall it had always been. Plaster, faintly discoloured at the ceiling corner where the damp got in from October to March. She had looked at it every morning for 4 years. She thought, my father kept accounts the way I keep accounts. Then she thought nothing for a while. After a time, she folded the letter, smoothed it precisely along its crease, and tucked it under the cedar box on the high shelf. The box still smelled of lavender. She had not moved it since the day she had taken out his old letter and read the line about hoping she was warm. He had known. Even then, she thought, he had been settling things. He had written a letter that said nothing alarming, and he had left a solicitor the name of the house where she worked, and he had died in November between 1 week and the next, and the cedar box with the £12 in it had reached her before she even knew he was gone. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend freely, and she was not going to spend them now on a man she had not spoken to in 4 years, no matter that he had left her everything he owned. She would think about crying later when the thinking was done. She went downstairs. She worked through the afternoon without variation. Agnes commented that the north passage looked cleaner than it had in 2 years, and Vera said only that the light was good today. She passed the Duke in the corridor just before supper. He was coming from the study with a sheaf of papers under one arm, and his attention entirely occupied by whatever was in his hand. She stepped to the side. He passed, but just before he did, she looked up. It was a fraction of a moment, no longer than it takes to draw a breath. She met his eyes, not accidentally, not with deference, but steadily, the way a person looks at something they are only now beginning to measure. He looked back. Then she looked away and walked on, and he walked on, and the corridor was empty again. She heard him stop, a single pause in his step, and then continue toward the staircase. Vera went to lay the supper table. She carried the figures from Peel's letter the way she had always carried the household figures, quietly, without display. In a part of herself, she had learned to keep separate from the part that folded napkins and blacked grates, and thanked people for things that were not kindnesses. She began that evening to count what she was owed, not in anger, in precision. The conservatory was cold at that hour of the morning, the kind of cold that settled in glass-walled rooms overnight and did not lift until well past noon. The ferns along the south wall had gone a little grey at the tips. Vera was carrying a bucket and a pair of work gloves, and had no particular reason to stop. Lady Miriam was already there, sitting in the low wicker chair beside the dead fountain, with a cup of something that had stopped steaming some time ago. She said, "Sit down, Vera." It was the second time in 1 week someone had said that to her, and the two invitations were nothing alike. Vera set down the bucket and sat. Lady Miriam did not speak immediately. She looked at the ferns, which were going grey regardless of anyone's opinion, and she turned the cup once in its saucer. She said, "Something has shifted in this house. I have been watching long enough to know what that looks like. I am not going to ask you what it is." Vera said nothing. Lady Miriam said, "I am going to say only this. Whatever you are holding, you should not hold it alone. I am not offering advice. I have no advice. I am offering company." The radiator in the corner ticked. Outside, the kitchen garden was brown and flat under a pale sky. Vera said, "My father died in November." She had not planned to say it. It arrived the way true things sometimes do, quietly, without warning, through a gap she had not known was open. Lady Miriam was still. Vera said, "He left me means to leave. I do not yet know all of it. A solicitor in Leeds is managing the estate. There are papers waiting." Lady Miriam set her cup down. She said, "I am sorry about your father." It was simply said, without decoration. Vera received it without deflection. She said, "We had not spoken in 4 years. He sent me a letter before he died. I did not know it was that kind of letter until after." Lady Miriam said, "Yes, those are the hardest kind." A silence. Not uncomfortable. The sort of silence two people keep when a true thing has been said, and the room is making room for it. Then Lady Miriam said, "Leaving and staying must be chosen, Vera, not defaulted into. One way or the other." Vera looked at her. Lady Miriam said, "I mean both directions. Leaving because one is afraid to stay is a default. Staying because one is afraid to leave is also a default. Neither one is a choice." Vera said, "I understand the distinction." Lady Miriam said, "I thought you would." She picked up her cup again, found it cold, and set it aside with the equanimity of someone who had long since stopped expecting tea to stay warm. She said nothing further. She did not ask for the figures or the details or the name of the solicitor. She simply remained in the chair, present and quiet, and let Vera remain beside her. And for a few minutes the conservatory was grey and still and not unpleasant. Vera picked up the bucket when she stood. Lady Miriam did not say goodbye, only looked at her in a way that meant the door was open, and had been for some time. That afternoon, Thomas Calder mentioned to the Duke in passing that a solicitor from Leeds by the name of Peel had now made direct contact with a member of the household staff. He said it the way Calder said most things, plainly, with no particular expression, as though it were merely a line in an account to be noted. The Duke heard it. He was at his desk. He did not look up immediately. When he did, Calder was already turning back toward the door. The Duke said, "Which member of staff?" Calder said, "Miss Sutton, Your Grace." The room was quiet for a moment. He went to Mrs. Alderton's office that evening, after the household had retired. The fire was out. The desk was clear and orderly. He opened the household correspondence drawer. It was empty. He stood at the desk for a moment, with his hand still on the drawer. He knew the shape of things now. Not the substance, not the figures, not the name of what Peel's letters contained, but the shape of it, the withheld correspondence, the woman in the north rooms, the offer to go quietly before quarter day that had apparently not been taken. He had not seen it. He had been in this house, and he had not seen it. He called for Mrs. Alderton first thing in the morning. Peel arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of March, when the frost had not quite gone from the gravel and the rooks were loud in the elms. He came in a hired chaise, not the common coach, and he carried a leather satchel that sat on his knees all the way up the drive. Calder met him at the front door. This was the first thing the household noticed. Peel came in at the front, was shown to the parlour, and was offered the chair by the window. Not the side entry, not the steward's room, the front parlour, with its good fire and its view of the lawn. Agnes, passing with a coal scuttle, saw it and reported it to the kitchen in under 3 minutes. The Duke received Peel in the study 20 minutes after that. Vera was sent for. The message came via Agnes, who appeared in the linen corridor with wide eyes, and said only, "Mr. Calder says you're wanted in the study, and there's a man in there, Vera, with a satchel." Vera set down the folded sheets. She smoothed her apron and went. The study door was open when she reached it. Calder stood to one side. Peel was already on his feet, a compact man of 50 or so, with a dry, precise face, and the kind of stillness that comes from long practice at delivering information in rooms full of people who do not want to hear it. The Duke was behind his desk. Agnes had not gone. She was in the doorway, holding nothing, pretending she had a reason to be there. Lady Miriam arrived from the corridor at Vera's shoulder, crossed the threshold without knocking, and sat down in the chair beside the window, as though she had been expected. No one said anything to her. She settled her hands in her lap and was quiet. Peel gave a short, business-like bow toward the Duke, and then turned to Vera. He said, "Miss Sutton, I am Peel, of Peel and Sons in Leeds. I am sorry for the delay in reaching you. I am sorrier still for the circumstances that make this necessary. Your father was a man of careful intentions, and I believe he wished this to be done properly." Vera said, "Thank you, Mr. Peel. Please go on." He set the satchel on the small table by the window. He produced a document, clean folded, with a wax seal already broken. He said, "The estate of Harold Sutton, wool merchant, late of Leeds, consists of the following: the Sutton warehouses on Mill Lane, Leeds, held freehold and clear of encumbrance, the townhouse on Marsh Lane, also freehold, and funds held in trust by this firm, to be released to the sole beneficiary in full upon production of identity and countersignature." He named the sum. Plainly, as figures are named. Once. The room received it. Peel folded the document and set it on the table with the efficient care of a man who knew that silence after figures was the correct response. Vera did not look at the Duke. She looked at Peel while he spoke, and she went on looking at him after he stopped, until she was certain the figures had settled into something that would not shift. Then she looked at the Duke. He was watching her. He had been watching her, she thought, since she had entered the room. His expression was controlled in the way that controlled expressions are when something behind them has moved considerably. His hands were flat on the desk. He said nothing. She gave him nothing back. Not coldness, not satisfaction. Nothing. Only her own face, as composed as it had always been in this room, in this house, in every room where she had been of use, and nothing further. Peel said, "Miss Sutton, I will need your signature, and arrangements must be discussed at your convenience." Vera said, "Yes, Mr. Peel. I know." She turned back to him. The cedar box was upstairs in her room, with his first letters inside it, and she had looked at the lavender-smelling pale wood twice this week, and thought of her father settling things in the August heat, and dying in November, and leaving her everything. She did not think of it now. She signed where Peel indicated. The Duke had not spoken. Agnes in the doorway forgot she was pretending, and simply stood. Peel left before noon. Calder saw him out at the front. The same courtesy extended in reverse, and the hired chaise went back down the drive with the satchel and the countersigned document inside it. The rooks were still loud in the elms. The frost had gone. Vera went back to the linen corridor. She did not think about the figure Peel had named. She had spent a week with it already, turning it over in the dark the way you turn a coin to check both sides, and it was still the same coin. She knew what it was. She did not need to hold it again right now. She was straightening the upper shelf, the one that required the step, when the Duke found her. She heard him before she saw him, his particular step in the corridor, even and unhurried, the step of a man who had never had reason to hurry in his own house. She did not come down from the step. He stopped in the doorway. He said, "Miss Sutton." It was the first time he had used her name. She registered it the way she registered most things at Ashmore Hall, quietly, in the part of herself that kept accounts. She said, "Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. She went on with the shelf. There was a correct order to these things, and she had kept to it for 4 years. He said, "I would like to offer you the position of housekeeper, full authority over the household staff, a salary commensurate with your capability. You have demonstrated both the knowledge and the judgment the role requires." He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. He had arrived at the words carefully, the way a man arrives carefully at something he believes is generous. Vera came down from the step. She set the folded cloth on the shelf and turned to face him. She said, "No, thank you, Your Grace." He said, "The terms are negotiable. If the salary—" She said, "It is not the salary." He waited. She said, "You are offering me my own work at a title after 4 years of doing it without one. I do not say that unkindly, but that is what you are offering." Lady Miriam's voice came from the corridor behind him, not loud, not directed at anyone in particular. He has just offered the woman her own lesser version of herself. The Duke went still. Lady Miriam did not appear in the doorway. Her footsteps continued down the corridor in the direction of the stairs, unhurried, as though she had said nothing more consequential than a comment on the weather. Vera looked at the Duke. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. There was something behind his eyes that she had not seen there before, though she could not have named it, only that it was not composure, and it was not the controlled efficiency she had watched from a careful distance for 4 years. She said, "I will leave at the end of the week. I will not inconvenience the household." And she paused, and then she said it because it was true and it wanted saying, "Thank you for the £12 and the cedar box." He said nothing. She picked up the step and carried it to the next shelf and went back to work. He found her that evening in the study. She was returning correspondence to the correct order on the shelves, the last of a task she had begun that morning. The fire had been lit but was still small. The room smelled of cold paper and wood smoke. He did not stand behind the desk this time. He said, "I am not offering a position." She went on with the shelves. He said, "I am asking you to stay, not as my employee." She was still for a moment. Then she set down the papers she was holding and turned. She said, "That is not a small thing to ask." He said, "No." She said, "You will require more than asking, then." She did not say it with heat or with satisfaction, only as a plain fact, correctly stated. He received it the way she had received most things in that room, without comment, without deflection, without looking away. The fire caught properly, and the light shifted. Outside the windows, the grounds were dark and cold and entirely silent. The morning came in grey and still, the kind of stillness that follows a night no one has slept well. The fire in the kitchen had been lit an hour, but the upper corridor was cold, and the light at the east window was the flat, white light of a sky that had not decided anything yet. Vera was dressed. She had been dressed since 5. She was standing at the window of her room with the cedar box in her hands, not opening it, only holding it, when she heard his step on the stair. She knew it. 4 years had given her that. He stopped at her door, which was open. He had not knocked at open doors as a habit, and he did not knock now. But he stopped in the frame, and he did not come in. He said, "Miss Sutton." She turned. He looked as though he had also been awake since 5, or earlier, and had decided that since he was going to appear undone, he would at least appear honestly undone. His cravat was correctly tied. The rest of him was a man who had spent the night at the edge of something. He said, "I want to tell you what I failed to see." She waited. He said, 4 years. You knew this house. You knew it in the figures and in the rooms, and in the order that kept it from coming apart when it was very close to coming apart. I didn't learn your name. I told myself that was efficiency, and it was not. It was the habit of a man who had decided that what the house ran on was not persons. He stopped. Started again. He said, "I offered you a position yesterday because that was the only language I had ready. I know what that was. My mother named it, and she was right." He paused. It cost him something to say that. She could see it cost him. I am telling you this not to correct a record. I am telling you because you are owed the truth of it in plain words, and I am the one who should say them. The window light was still flat and grey. Somewhere above them, a door opened and closed. He said, "I know what you have. I know you can go. I am not asking you to stay because there is anything you require from me. I am asking because I would like to spend the rest of my life learning your name properly. All the rest of it. The parts I do not yet know. It was not eloquent." He was right that it was not. It was true. In the corridor behind him, a footstep paused and did not continue. Lady Miriam, who had been heading toward the stairs, stood very still and listened, and then quietly didn't move on. Vera looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the cedar box in her hands and set it on the shelf beside her. She said, "I will not be a correction you make to yourself, Edmund." His name. She had not said it before. She said, "But I will be chosen, plainly, if I am chosen at all." He said, "Plainly." And when she turned to face him fully, he crossed the threshold and caught her hand, and she let him. And he bent his head and kissed her there in the cold corridor, with the grey light coming through and Lady Miriam in the doorway behind him, not continuing walking at all. It was brief. It was witnessed. It was enough. They were married quietly in April, when the blackthorn was out in the lane, and the morning was cold and smelled of green things starting. Peel attended and shook hands with Calder on the church step. Agnes cried before the service began, and at intervals after. Thomas Calder stood very straight and was twice observed looking with great attention at the ceiling. 3 years on, the hall at Ashmore was a different kind of silence, which is to say, it was not silence at all. There was a child somewhere above, and Agnes's voice from the kitchen and the sound of the conservatory door that never latched quite right. The cedar box sat on the shelf in the study. The father's letter was folded inside it. On the wall above hung the first page of the Sutton Trust document in a plain frame. The ink gone a little brown at the edges. Vera passed it without looking at it. She knew what it said. She had always known what it said. What it had given her was not the warehouses or the townhouse, or the figure Peel had read aloud in this very room 3 years ago. What it had given her was the door. She had been the one to walk through it. If this story found you somewhere warm, or somewhere you needed warmth, come and sit by the fire a moment. There is always something on, and the door is never locked. And until next time, good night, and be kind to the quiet ones you pass in the hall. You never quite know who is holding the whole house